He told this story years later with a shaky laugh, saying he never expected one small hand to change the entire direction of his life. That night, he was just a tired man walking home, not an action hero, not a legend, just someone trying to disappear into the city's shadows. Rain had stopped only an hour ago, leaving the sidewalk slick and shining under the yellow streetlights. Keanu walked with his head down, baseball cap low, backpack hanging off one shoulder. He'd had a long day on set and an even longer day inside his own thoughts, the kind where old regrets get louder than any director's voice. The alley he cut through was one he'd used 1,000 times before, a back route that smelled like oil and metal and late-night food trucks. He wanted silence, anonymity, and maybe a hot shower at the end of it. Instead, halfway down that narrow passage, he heard a small voice behind him say, clear and steady, "Mister, can you follow me home?" He turned, expecting a fan, a selfie request, security somewhere nearby. But there was just her, a little black girl around 7 or 8 standing alone in a pink hoodie that was too thin for the cold. Her hair was pulled into 2 puffs, slightly frizzy from the rain, and her sneakers were soaked through. She looked straight at him, not starstruck, not scared, just tired in a way no child should ever look. For a second, he forgot he was supposed to be invisible. He took off his cap so she could see his face more clearly and crouched a little to meet her eyes. "Hey," he said gently, "are you lost? Where are your parents?" She shook her head with a firmness that didn't match her trembling hands. "They're not coming," she answered, as if it were a fact she had practiced. Her voice didn't break, but her fingers twisted the edge of her sleeve again and again. "I just need you to follow me home, please." There was no recognition in her gaze, no flicker of, "Oh my God, it's you." To her, he was just a tall stranger in a dark jacket, someone who might say yes or might keep walking. That, more than anything, made something inside his chest not painfully tight. Fame had built a wall around him for years. This little girl was asking him to step right through it. He glanced around the alley, instinctively searching for a camera crew, a prank, anyone watching. But the place was too quiet. Only the distant hum of traffic and a rattling window above them broke the silence. Far down the corridor, a dumpster lid banged in the wind, and somewhere a dog barked twice and went quiet. He realized with a small chill that if he walked away now, no one would even know she had been there. This wasn't a script. There was no call sheet, no stunt coordinator, no safe word. It was just a real child asking for help in a real, uncaring corner of the city. He felt resistance rise inside him, old habits, old fears. He knew the stories, the accusations that could follow a famous man being seen with a child alone. He knew how quick people were to judge, how ruthless tabloids could be. Part of him wanted to run from the risk, from the headlines, from the complicated questions. But another part of him, the one that still believed people were supposed to protect each other, stared at the lines of dirt on the girl's cheeks and the way she winced when she shifted her weight as if one ankle hurt. That part refused to let him walk away. "Okay," he said at last, keeping his voice calm and low. "My name is Keanu. What's yours?" She hesitated, then answered so quietly he almost missed it. "Amara." The name felt too big and too beautiful for a little girl shivering in a dark alley. He offered his hand, slowly, giving her time to trust the gesture. After a long heartbeat, her small fingers slid into his, cold and damp but surprisingly strong. As soon as he wrapped his hand around hers, he felt it. She was shaking, not from the weather alone, but from something deeper. Fear, exhaustion, maybe both. "All right, Amara," he said, standing up and letting her lead. "Show me where home is." She pulled him toward the far end of the alley, away from the main street and its safe, familiar chaos. With each step, the city seemed to shift from bright and noisy to quiet and strange. The deeper they went, the more the world narrowed into cracked concrete and peeling paint, broken glass crunching under their shoes. Somewhere behind them, a siren wailed and then faded. A thin thread of smoke drifted from further ahead, carrying the bitter smell of something burning. Keanu's instincts screamed that this was wrong, that no child's home should be anywhere near this kind of darkness. But Amara's grip only tightened, her small body pulling forward with desperate purpose. As they turned a corner, the alley opened slightly and the shadows grew thicker, swallowing the last comfortable glow of the streetlights. On the left wall, smeared across the stained concrete, he saw it. A single red handprint streaked downward as if someone had dragged their fingers while they fell. The color was too bright, too fresh-looking. It stopped him mid-step. His breath caught, and he instinctively moved Amara behind him, shielding her without even thinking. The air felt heavier here, weighted with heat, with something metallic and sharp that burned in the back of his throat. Amara looked up at him, her eyes suddenly wide, not with surprise, but with something closer to guilt. Before he could ask anything, a dull boom echoed from ahead, and a faint orange glow flickered to life farther down the passage, like the first breath of a growing fire. Amara squeezed his hand so hard it almost hurt. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice finally cracking. "But I didn't tell you everything." He didn't move at first. The echo of the small explosion rolled through the alley, bouncing off the walls and settling in his chest like a warning. That orange glow ahead wasn't just light. It was alive, moving and pulsing, throwing long, trembling shadows along the cracked concrete. Keanu swallowed hard, feeling the old adrenaline stir in his veins, the same rush he felt before a dangerous stunt, except this time there were no safety cables, no rehearsals. Just a little girl gripping his hand, and a fire growing somewhere very close to where she called home. "Amara," he said carefully, keeping his body between her and the glow, "what didn't you tell me?" His voice came out quieter than he intended, softer, as if anything louder might shatter what little strength she had left. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared past him, toward the source of the light, her small jaw clenched, eyes glistening. He could see her wrestling with something heavy and complicated, something too big for such small shoulders. When she finally spoke, the words sounded like they had been waiting inside her for a long time. "I don't know if it's still there," she whispered, "or if it's all gone now." A low crackle reached them, like dry wood snapping inside a furnace. Heat brushed against his face, faint but real. Keanu took a breath and did something that had always helped him on the hardest days. He grounded himself in the moment, one hand on Amara's, one step at a time. "Look at me," he said gently. She dragged her gaze up to his, blinking back tears she clearly didn't want him to see. "You're not alone, okay? Whatever's ahead, we face it together. But I need to know what I'm walking into. Who's at home, Amara?" Her lips trembled, and for the first time he saw past the practiced toughness to the scared child underneath. "My mom," she said, voice shaking. "And my brother, he's little. They were there when I left. I think they're still there. They have to be." The last sentence came out more as a plea than a statement, and it pierced him. He imagined a woman and a small boy trapped somewhere near that orange light, maybe coughing, maybe unconscious, maybe worse. The fear that had been curling inside his own ribs shifted into something else. Purpose, sharp and steady. He squeezed her hand. "Okay, then we get them," he said, the decision settling into him like a weight he was willing to carry. He moved forward, guiding her carefully, alert for every sound, every shift of color in the dark. As they drew closer, the heat intensified, first like the warmth of a distant oven, then like standing too near a bonfire. The alley opened into a narrow courtyard crowded with rusted metal doors and sagging balconies. One door stood out, second from the left, paint peeling in strips, its frame glowing with that horrible orange light from inside. Thin smoke seeped from the gap at the top, curling into the cold night air. Above them, a window with a cracked pane coughed out another plume of smoke. Mara froze, her fingers dug into his palm. "That's home," she breathed. He could hear the tremor of memory in those two words, see the invisible pictures replaying behind her eyes, better days, maybe, before the smoke and the fire and the fear. Keanu scanned the scene quickly, heart pounding. No firefighters, no neighbors outside, no one yelling, no sirens growing closer. This fire was young, starting to wake up, stretching its arms through the old wooden bones of the building, but no one had called for help. No one had noticed, or worse, no one had cared. He turned to Amara. "Did you call anyone?" he asked. "Police, fire department, anyone at all?" She shook her head, panic suddenly spilling over. "My phone died. I ran outside and no one opened the doors when I knocked. I thought," she broke off, shoulders shaking. "I saw you. You were the only one who looked like you might stop." The words hit him like a quiet, heavy punch. He'd spent years trying to slip through the world unseen, ducking cameras and crowds, keeping his head down. Tonight, that same low profile had made him invisible to almost everyone. Everyone except a desperate child who saw in his tired face something she could gamble on. He knelt, bringing his eyes level with hers despite the smoke stinging them both now. "Amara, listen to me. You did the bravest thing you could do. You got out. You asked for help. That takes courage, okay? Real courage." She sniffed, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, nodding once, but he could tell she didn't believe him, not yet. She looked past him again at the door, at the thin line of flickering light breathing from the cracks. "If they die," she whispered, "it's my fault. I left them." The rawness of that sentence cut through whatever fear he had left. He shook his head firm. "No, you leaving is the reason any of you might make it. Do you understand? You were strong enough to get help. That's not weakness, that's strength." For a moment, the alley, the smoke, the danger, all of it blurred around them. It was just a grown man who had spent a lifetime carrying his own ghosts, talking to a girl who was just starting to collect hers. He saw himself in her, guilt, survivor's instinct that urged to blame yourself for circumstances you never created. He couldn't fix his past, but maybe he could stop hers from being carved by the same sharp knife. He stood, pulling off his jacket in one smooth motion and wrapping it around her shoulders. "Stay back here by the wall," he told her. "Cover your mouth with the collar. If anything feels wrong, if the fire gets bigger, if you can't breathe, you move farther away. Promise me." Fear flashed through her eyes, followed by stubborn refusal. "I'm coming with you," she said. "They're my family." That single sentence carried so much love and determination it made his throat tighten, but he shook his head. "You help by staying alive, Amara. I can't go in there if I'm worried about you breathing smoke. You want to help your mom and your brother. Then you have to trust me and stay right here. That's your job. Can you do that?" It was a cruel choice to give a child, but the world had already been cruel tonight. She stared at him, small chest heaving, tears tracing clean paths down her sooty cheeks. Slowly, like it hurt her, she nodded. "I'll stay," she whispered, voice breaking. "But you have to come back. All of you have to come back." There it was, the impossible promise hanging in the air between them. He couldn't guarantee anything. He wasn't a movie character with plot armor. He was a human being about to step into a burning building. But he knew what she needed to hear in that moment. A lifeline made of words, thin but strong enough to hold onto. He took her hand one last time and squeezed it. "I will do everything I can," he said, letting her see the seriousness in his eyes. "I won't stop, not until I find them." She pressed her lips together, then reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out something small and folded, a crumpled photograph. She shoved it into his palm. "So you know their faces," she murmured. "So you don't leave them behind." He unfolded it quickly. A worn image, slightly water-damaged. A woman with tired but kind eyes, a little boy with a gap-toothed grin, and Amara in the middle, younger but unmistakable. All three of them crowded into the frame as if they were afraid the world would crop one of them out. He tucked the photograph safely into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. "I won't leave them," he said quietly. Then, with one last look at her, small, shaking, pressed against the wall but standing her ground, he turned toward the door. As he reached for the handle, the metal burned his palm, forcing him to jerk his hand back. The fire was angrier now, louder. Inside, something heavy crashed to the floor, followed by a sound that made his blood run cold. A faint, muffled cry, high and thin, like a child calling out from behind a wall. He looked over his shoulder. Amara had heard it too. Her eyes went wide, her body surging forward instinctively before she slammed herself back against the wall, keeping her shaky promise. "That's him," she choked. "That's my brother." Smoke seeped thicker from the frame, stinging his eyes, clawing at his throat. The world narrowed to a single choice, a single doorway, a single moment. He drew in one last clean breath of night air, reached for the burning handle again despite the pain, and pushed his way into the heat, knowing with a clarity that stole his fear that whether he came back or not, this was the only right thing left to do. The door slammed behind him with a hollow, echoing thud, cutting Amara off from his silhouette and leaving her alone in the alley, staring at the thin line of smoke where he had just disappeared. Later, he would say the first breath inside that apartment felt like swallowing sand and smoke at the same time. The air was thick, heavy with burning plastic and old wood, turning every inhale into a fight. Heat slapped him from all sides, licking at his skin even through his shirt. Flames hadn't fully claimed the place yet, but they were working their way through it with greedy patience, crawling along the ceiling, chewing at the door frames. In the dim, flickering light, the small living room looked like a memory on fire. Family photos warping on the walls, a couch half melted, toys scattered across the floor like someone had dropped them mid-play and never come back. He dropped low like he'd learned on every safety video and every stunt set. Smoke rose, breathable air hugged the floor. He pressed his forearm over his mouth and nose, tasting ash and fear, and forced himself to move forward on hands and knees. Somewhere above the crackle and hiss of flames, that thin cry came again, sharper now, a child's voice, a cough. He couldn't make out the words, only the desperation. "Hey," he shouted, throat burning. "It's okay, I'm coming, keep making noise." His voice sounded small in the chaos, but it was something, a thread for whoever was trapped to grab onto. On the coffee table, a framed picture lay face down. He grabbed it without thinking, flipping it over for a split second. The same three faces from the photo in his pocket, frozen in happier light. The glass had already started to crack from the heat. He set it back gently, almost reverently, as if promising the room he'd bring them back to it. Moving through the apartment felt like crawling inside a fever dream. Every corner held some piece of this family's life. A pair of tiny sneakers by the door, a school backpack slumped against the wall, a drawing taped crookedly to the fridge, a son with a smile, three stick figures holding hands. The ordinariness of it made the danger feel almost obscene. He reached the hallway and hesitated for half a heartbeat. Two doors on the left, one on the right, flames chewing at their edges. The cry came again, muffled, then cut off in a choking cough. It sounded closer to the second door on the left. He moved toward it, but part of him whispered that guessing wrong could cost lives. That's when he noticed it, the faint outline of chalk stars along the bottom of the second door, drawn at a child's height. Little uneven shapes, some smudged, some more recent. A kid's door. A boy's, maybe. He didn't have the luxury to doubt it. The handle burned his already blistered palm, but he pushed past the pain and shoved the door open with his shoulder. A wave of hotter air rolled over him, like opening an oven too fast. The room beyond flickered orange and black smoke curling along the ceiling like a living thing. The fire hadn't fully taken the bed yet, but the curtains were glowing at the edges, ready to burst into flames. On the floor beside the bed, half curled in a ball with a blanket over his head, was a small boy. He coughed so hard his whole body shook, hands clenched around a battered stuffed bear. Keanu crossed the room in 3 stumbling strides, dropping lower as the air thickened. "Hey, buddy," he rasped, reaching out. "I've got you, I'm here." The boy flinched at the touch, then looked up, eyes red and streaming, face streaked with soot. He couldn't have been more than 4. For a beat, panic and relief warred on that tiny face, and then the boy grabbed him, in the shirt, in the arm, anywhere he could, and clung like he'd been drowning and had just felt land. "Amara," the boy coughed. "Where's Mara?" "She's safe," Keanu said, pulling the blanket over the boy's head to shield him from falling sparks. "She's outside. She got help. She's waiting for you." He could feel the boy's small chest heave against his own as the child tried to process that, tried to believe it. "I want Mama," the boy sobbed into his shoulder, voice breaking. "Mama said don't open the door." The fear in his words added a new weight to the air. Mama still inside, maybe in another room, maybe past the point of saving. The thought tightened something dangerous inside Keanu, but he pushed it down, one step at a time. He lifted the boy up, tucking him tight against his chest, one arm wrapped around his back, the other shielding his head. The child's stuffed bear was trapped between them, its small plastic eye pressing into Keanu's ribs. "Hold on to me," he said. "Don't let go." The boy wrapped his arms around his neck with a ferocity that almost choked him. As he turned back toward the hallway, a loud crack split the room. The curtains finally surrendered to the heat, exploding into bright, hungry flame. It leapt upward, racing along the rod and licking at the ceiling. The heat surged, pushing him harder toward the exit. The hallway was worse now. Fire had found new paths along the walls, chewing through peeling paint and old wood. Smoke rolled in dark waves, thicker, angrier. He ducked below it as much as he could, but each breath still felt like it scraped down his throat. The boy coughed again, weaker this time. "Hey, stay with me," Keanu murmured against his hair. "Tell me your name. What's your name?" There was a small pause, then a cracked whisper. "Eli." The name was barely there, but it was enough. Now he wasn't just carrying the boy. He was carrying Eli, Amara's brother, the child from the photo. A real person with a real future that might still exist if they made it out. He crawled as fast as he dared, feeling the floorboards heat through his jeans. Part of him calculated distances like a stunt, the angle to the door, the likely spread of flames, odds of structural collapse. But another, quieter part of him kept seeing Amara's face outside, that mix of courage and terror. He'd told her he wouldn't stop. That promise anchored him more than any professional instinct. In the living room, the fire had grown teeth. The ceiling above the couch sagged ominously, parts of it already blackened through. A beam creaked like a tired, angry bone. He squinted through the smoke, mind racing. "Almost there, Eli," he said, more for himself than the child. "You just keep breathing. We're gonna show your sister that you're tougher than this fire, okay?" The boy made a tiny, broken noise that might have been a laugh or a sob. It didn't matter. It meant he was still here, still fighting. Halfway across the room, his burned hand gave a sharp, blinding throb, and for a terrifying second his grip on the boy slipped. Eli's weight shifted, and instinct roared louder than pain. Keanu tightened his hold, fingers screaming, muscles shaking. He couldn't afford to be weak, not now. That old voice, the one that always told him he wasn't enough, that he'd failed too many people already, tried to rise. But he pushed back against it with something simpler, cleaner. "I'm not leaving this kid. I don't care what it costs." He adjusted Eli higher on his hip and angled his body between the boy and a burst of sparks from the collapsing curtains. Ash dusted his hair, caught in his eyelashes. He could feel his lungs straining, each breath shorter than the last. The room swayed around him, not from the fire, but from the edges of his own strength starting to fray. Just a few more steps. Just the door, just the alley, just air. Then he heard it, a sound that sliced through the roar of the flames like a blade. A low, rough cough, not a child's, deeper, weaker, coming from the other side of the room through the haze near the kitchen doorway. He froze. The front door and the promise of clean air were only a few strides away. He could almost feel the night outside, cool and safe. Eli clung to him, little hands twisted in his collar. The kid was so light, so easy to carry compared to the heaviness of the choice that suddenly landed on his shoulders. "Mama said don't open the door," Eli had said. Mama was still inside. He turned his head, squinting through the smoke toward the kitchen. Shapes shifted, warped by heat. Cabinets, a table, chairs overturned. And there on the floor just beyond the threshold, a darker form, barely moving. A hand twitched, fingers scraping weakly at the tile as if trying to crawl toward an exit that never came. Another cough, dry and rattling, shivered through the room. Keanu's pulse hammered in his ears. He could rush Eli outside now, place him in Amara's arms, give at least one child back their brother. Then come back in maybe if the fire didn't take the building first, if his body didn't give out, if the ceiling didn't collapse. Or he could turn away from the door right now, step deeper into the flames with Eli still in his arms, and try to pull a full-grown woman to safety too. The math was ugly. The risk tripled instantly. Every survival instinct screamed at him to take the boy out first, to secure one life before gambling on another. But his heart threw another picture in front of him. Amara, alone in that alley, asking a stranger to follow her home because no one else would. Her eyes when she said, "So you don't leave them behind." He thought of all the times in his own life when help had come just a second too late, when someone hadn't made it, when guilt carved new lines on his face. He knew what it felt like to live with questions like, what if I'd tried one more time, gone one step farther? He couldn't put that weight on Amara. He couldn't add another ghost to his own. He shut his eyes for half a beat, then opened them with a new, stubborn clarity. "Eli," he said, voice rough, "your mom's in there. I think I hear her. I'm gonna get her, but I need you to be braver than you've ever been. Can you do that for me?" Eli coughed weakly against his neck, then nodded, a tiny motion that felt like the bravest yes in the world. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, the distant wail of sirens finally began to rise, still faint but getting closer, as if the city had only just woken up to the danger. Inside, the fire crept closer to the kitchen, hungry and bright. Keanu tightened his grip on the boy, turned his back on the nearest exit, and stepped toward the darker side of the room, toward the fallen figure, the choking cough, and the part of the story where a single wrong move could cost all three of them everything. He moved toward the kitchen like a man walking into a storm he already accepted. Each step felt heavier, the floor hotter under his knees and palms. Fire licked along the ceiling in jagged streaks, throwing wild shadows that twisted the room into something half real, half nightmare. Eli's arms were locked around his neck, small fingers digging into his skin, but the boy didn't make a sound now, just buried his face into Keanu's shoulder, trusting him completely. That trust burned almost as fiercely as the flames. The coughing came again, weaker this time, from just beyond the kitchen doorway. Through the thick smoke, he could finally make out her shape. A woman sprawled on the tile, one arm stretched toward the hall as if she'd gotten close, so close before the fire and the fumes dragged her down. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, and there was a dark smear on the floor where she'd tried to crawl. She wasn't moving much, just a faint shudder with each rattling breath. The sight hit him like a blow. This was the woman from the photo in his pocket. This was Mama. Keanu dropped lower, his lungs screaming in protest. "Ma'am," he forced out, voice raw. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, then lifted a fraction. For a second they locked eyes, his stinging and red, hers glassy and unfocused. Somewhere in that haze, recognition flashed, but not the celebrity kind. It was the recognition of someone realizing in the last possible moment that help had actually come. Her fingers twitched toward him, then slipped weakly against the tile. He had seconds, maybe. Less. Every CPR class, every safety briefing he'd ever half-listened to on a set crashed together in his mind. He shifted Eli carefully, cradling the boy tighter with one arm, then reached for the woman with the other, fingers sliding under her shoulders. She was heavier than he'd braced for, dead weight, limp and uncooperative. But he adjusted his position, planting his knees, using what leverage he had left. For all the fight scenes he'd ever done, all the illusions of strength people imagined he had, this moment of lifting a real, unconscious human with a terrified child clamped to him was the hardest thing he'd ever done. "Hang on, Eli," he gasped, drawing the woman closer. "We've got your mom, we've got her." The boy whimpered, a choked sound of fear and hope tangled together. Heat blasted them from the stove, where grease had started to spit and pop under the encroaching flames. A cabinet above them groaned, wood cracking. He didn't have a plan beyond this instant. Just move, just pull, just don't let go. He dragged her inch by inch, muscles screaming, vision tunneling. The tiles were slick with spilled something, oil maybe or water from a dish, making it harder to get traction. He gritted his teeth and dug in, using his weight, his legs, every stubborn piece of will he had left. "Come on," he muttered, barely aware he was talking aloud. "Come on, we're not stopping here, not tonight." Her shoe caught on the threshold. He twisted, yanked, felt something give, and finally managed to pull her fully into the living room, away from the heart of the flames that were now devouring the kitchen doorway. By the time they cleared the frame, his lungs were on fire. Every breath felt like trying to inhale through soaked cloth. The room spun for a second, black spots flirting at the edges of his vision. The front door, salvation, clean air, Amara, glowed faintly through the smoke, only a few desperate feet away, but it looked impossibly far. Between them and that door, a charred beam groaned overhead, sagging more with each passing heartbeat. He knew with a sharp, cruel clarity that he didn't have the strength for 2 trips. This was it, all or nothing. "Eli," he croaked, dragging himself forward with the last of his power, the woman's weight pulling at his shoulder. "I need you to do something brave again, okay?" The boy's head lifted just enough for him to see one watery eye, wide and terrified. "You're gonna keep your arms around my neck just like this. Don't loosen them no matter what. You're my anchor. Got it?" Eli nodded faintly, tears disappearing into Keanu's shirt. He hooked his burned arm more firmly under the woman's back, ignoring the way pain exploded up his wrist and into his elbow. Every inch forward felt like a mountain. He thought of all the times he'd felt like he'd failed people he loved, like he'd arrived one moment too late. Then he thought of Amara outside, clutching that empty space where her family should be, and something inside him refused to break. If he had to crawl, he would crawl. If he had to drag his own body along the floor like hers, he would do that too. The beam above them groaned again, a long, ugly sound, then cracked like a gunshot. Instinct flared. He threw his body forward in one last lunge, pulling them with him. The world exploded in dust and sparks as the beam crashed behind them, sending a shockwave of heat and splinters across the room. The impact knocked him forward, slamming his shoulder into the floor. For a second, the world went silent and white. He didn't know how he moved after that. Later, he'd only remember flashes, the burn of the doorknob against his forearm as he shoved it open with his shoulder. The sudden rush of cold night air slamming into his face like a blessing. The roar of the fire sounding distant as the world outside flooded in, sirens now wailing loud and near, someone shouting orders, footsteps pounding toward them. He half fell, half stumbled into the alley, dragging the woman, still holding Eli against his chest. The boy coughed, sucking in fresh air, crying in small, broken gasps. Voices swarmed around them, but one cut through everything. "Eli, Mama!" Amara's cry tore through the night, raw and high, and so full of fear and love that it made his knees buckle. She sprinted toward them, face streaked with tears and soot, jacket sleeves hanging past her hands. A firefighter grabbed her first, trying to hold her back for her own safety, but she twisted in his grasp, eyes locked on the small shape in Keanu's arms. "Eli!" she screamed again. The boy lifted his head, eyes unfocused at first, then clearing. "Mara!" he rasped, reaching for her with a shaking hand. The firefighter saw it and with a quick nod let her go. She practically threw herself at them, arms wrapping around Eli and part of Keanu both, as if unsure where one ended and the other began. "You're okay," she sobbed into her brother's hair. "You're okay, you're okay, you're okay." Her voice broke on every repetition, but this time it wasn't guilt speaking. It was pure relief. Paramedics descended like a practice storm. Strong hands eased Eli from Keanu's arms, placed an oxygen mask over his face, wrapped him in a blanket. Another pair of hands helped lay the woman, Amara and Eli's mother, onto a waiting stretcher. One medic checked her pulse, another cleared her airway, a third fitted an oxygen mask over her face. "She's got a pulse," someone called out. "Shallow, but it's there. Let's move, let's move." The words washed over him like cool water, not gone. "Not yet, not tonight." He sank to his knees on the wet concrete, the adrenaline finally giving way. His burned hands shook uncontrollably. The cold bit into his sweat-soaked clothes, but after the furnace of the apartment, it felt like heaven. Someone draped a blanket over his shoulders, another tried to guide him toward a different stretcher. He shook his head at first, stubbornness flaring. "I'm fine," he croaked, though he knew it wasn't true. His chest hurt, his throat felt shredded, his palms were blistered and raw. But fine was less about his body, and more about a deep, stubborn refusal to make this about him. Then he saw Amara. She'd broken away from the paramedics for just a moment, slipping past them with the quiet speed of a child who has had to grow up too fast. She walked toward him slowly now, as if afraid he might disappear if she moved too quickly. Her eyes were swollen from smoke and tears, but there was a new light in them, a fragile, unbelieving hope. Behind her, Eli lay on a gurney, a mask strapped to his tiny face, blinking up at the night. Their mother's stretcher was being loaded carefully into the back of an ambulance, a medic squeezing an oxygen bag, another adjusting lines. Amara stopped in front of him, small hands twisting in the sleeves of his jacket that still hung on her shoulders. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Neither did he. The world narrowed again, but this time it wasn't because of danger. It was because everything that mattered was suddenly right here. The girl who'd asked a stranger to follow her home, the stranger who decided not to turn away, and the fragile, unbelievable fact that they had all made it out alive. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "You came back," she said, as if she hadn't fully expected it, as if some part of her had already prepared to stand in this alley alone again. Then, before he could answer, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce, clumsy hug. She was still shaking, but this time it wasn't from terror. It was from the sheer release of having survived. He hugged her back carefully, mindful of his burns, his muscles aching. "You got them help," he murmured into her hair. "You saved them, Amara, don't forget that." She pulled back, frowning through her tears. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You did." Her voice trembled, but there was a stubborn certainty in it. "I just asked. You went in there. You could have died." He held her gaze, feeling the weight of her words settle between them. For a second he thought about arguing, telling her again that courage is asking, that her decision to run outside, to trust a stranger, was the first domino that knocked all the others down. But he saw something else in her eyes, too, a deeper need. She needed to believe that sometimes, when you called out for help, someone actually showed up, that the world was still capable of that kind of goodness. "Maybe," he said softly, "but I wasn't the only brave one tonight." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the crumpled photograph, edges now slightly singed from the heat. "You gave me this so I wouldn't leave them behind. I didn't." He pressed it into her hand. "Now it's your reminder. Whenever you start thinking you're weak or that leaving was a mistake, you look at this, okay? You remember that you fought for them when it mattered." She stared at the photo for a long moment, thumb tracing over her own small face in the middle, over Eli, over her mother's strained but smiling expression. A single tear fell onto the picture and spread in a thin line, but she didn't wipe it away. She just nodded slowly, clutching it like a promise. A paramedic approached, concern etched into his features. "Sir, we really need to take a look at your hands and lungs," he said. "You inhaled a lot of smoke. You're not walking this off." There was a hint of a smile there, respectful but insistent. The old instinct to deflect, to say, "I'm good, take care of them," rose up again. But then he caught Amara watching him, eyes wide, studying how he handled his own pain. He realized something in that moment. Courage wasn't just running into burning buildings. It was also letting yourself be helped, letting yourself be human, showing a kid who'd had to grow up too fast that even the adults who seemed strongest still needed other people sometimes. "Yeah," he said at last, nodding to the medic. "Okay, I'll let you do your job." He turned back to Amara. "They're going to take your mom and Eli to the hospital. You're riding with them, all right? Don't worry, they'll both get the best care. You stay with your brother, that's your job now." She swallowed hard but stood a little straighter, shoulders squaring beneath the too big jacket. "I will," she said. "I won't leave him." As the paramedics guided him toward a second ambulance, he heard one of the firefighters murmuring to another, low but not low enough. "Guy runs into a burning building like that? Remind you of anyone?" There was a chuckle, a quiet, disbelieving laugh. Someone else said his name like it was a headline instead of a person. But to him, in that moment, none of that mattered. The only thing he cared about was the small figure climbing carefully into the back of the other ambulance, clutching a photograph in one hand and her brother's tiny fingers in the other. At the hospital, hours blurred into tests and oxygen masks, stinging ointment on blistered skin, doctors' calm but serious voices. He answered questions, signed forms, kept his eyes on the updates that came in about Amara's family. Eli was stable. Smoke inhalation, but his lungs were young, strong, and he'd likely make a full recovery. Their mother was in more serious condition, but the doctors used words like responsive and good chance instead of the ones that froze blood. Each positive update felt like a brick being lifted off his chest. Sometime near dawn, when the sky was just beginning to think about turning from black to gray, a nurse led Amara into his room. She still had his jacket draped over her shoulders, now spotted with hospital hallway dust and the faint smell of antiseptic. Her hair was pulled back with a borrowed elastic, and there was a plastic hospital bracelet around her wrist, but her eyes looked clearer. Tired, yes, but clearer. "They said I could come say thank you," she announced quietly, hovering in the doorway as if unsure where the line was between intrusion and gratitude. He pushed himself up a little, wincing at the pull in his ribs. "You already did," he replied, offering a small smile. "But you can do it again if it makes you feel better." Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a frown. "They said my mom woke up," she said instead. "She asked where Eli was. I told her he's okay. I told her. I told her you came." Her voice cracked on the last word. He swallowed past the lump in his throat. "How did she react?" he asked softly. Amara looked down at her hands, fiddling with the hospital bracelet. "She cried," she said, "but like good crying, I think. She said she heard someone yelling in the fire and she thought it was an angel." Amara looked up, meeting his gaze. "I told her it was just some guy I found in an alley." The line was so unexpectedly dry and sharp that he laughed, a real, rough-edged laugh that hurt his lungs but felt honest. "Just some guy," he echoed. "I like that better than angel. I'm definitely not that." She stepped closer, her expression shifting, more serious now. "I think you're just a good person," she said. "That's harder to find." He wanted to tell her that he'd spent years doubting that about himself, that he'd replayed mistakes and losses, and wondered if he could ever balance them out. But he didn't want to weigh her down with his history. Tonight wasn't about his ghosts. It was about hers almost getting born and then being pushed back by one wild, defiant act of courage, and a stranger who refused to walk away. Instead, he said, "You know what I think is harder to find? A kid who runs into the night to find help when everyone else pretends not to see her. That's rare." She shook her head, but this time there was a flicker of something proud in the motion. "I was scared," she admitted. "I almost didn't say anything to you. You looked like you didn't want to be bothered." There was no accusation in it, just observation. He winced a little at the truth of it. "I probably didn't," he said. "At least I thought I didn't. But sometimes what we think we want and what we actually need are two very different things." She frowned thoughtfully. "What did you need?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. He'd expected gratitude, maybe awkward silence, not this quiet, direct curiosity. He took a breath, feeling the oxygen tickle in his chest. "I needed a reminder," he answered slowly, picking his words with care. "That all the stuff people say about kindness and bravery, it isn't just for movies. It's supposed to be real life, too. I think I'd started to forget that a little. You reminded me." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that feels full instead of empty. Then she glanced at his burned hands, now wrapped in white gauze. They said you might have scars, she said. Does that bother you? He looked at the bandages, flexing his fingers carefully. Scars are just proof you were there when it mattered, he said quietly. I can live with that. She nodded, seeming to turn that thought over in her mind like a smooth stone. As she started to back toward the door, she paused and reached into the pocket of his jacket. He watched, curious, as she pulled out the crumpled photograph again. But instead of taking it with her, she walked to his bedside table and set it down there, smoothing it out with gentle fingers. You keep it, she said, so you don't forget you were there when it mattered, and so you remember us, in case you ever start thinking people aren't worth the trouble. The weight of that simple sentence settled on him in a way no award or headline ever had. This wasn't admiration from a distance. This was a child choosing to believe in him as a person, not an image. His voice came out softer than he intended. Deal, he murmured. But only if you promise me something too. She tilted her head. What? Promise me that whenever you're scared in the future, you'll remember tonight, not just the fire, but the fact that you didn't run from helping. You ran toward it. Promise me you'll never let anyone convince you that you're small or powerless after what you did. She considered this, then held out her pinky, solemn as a judge. Pinky promise, she said. He smiled and hooked his own, bandaged and clumsy, around hers. The smallest contract in the world, sealing something far bigger. Later, when the world found out what had happened, when headlines screamed about the famous actor who ran into a burning building for strangers, when talk shows and interviews tried to turn the night into a neat story with a beginning, middle, and end, he always told it the same way. He said he hadn't been the hero of that night. Not really. He said the story started with a little black girl in a pink hoodie who walked up to a man in an alley and said, "Follow me home," and didn't give up even when the world had already started to. He told them that kindness isn't always comfortable, courage isn't always glamorous, and real humility is understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else show you who you still have the chance to be. He said that for every person who walks away, there's someone like Amara who still dares to ask for help. And someone like you listening to this story who will get to decide at some point in your life whether you'll follow. And he always ended it the same quiet way, by saying that on one smoky, fire-lit night in a forgotten corner of the city, a tired man and a terrified child saved each other. Not from flames alone, but from the colder kind of danger, the temptation to believe that we're all alone in this world. Because that night proved something neither of them would ever forget. Sometimes when a small hand reaches out and says, "Come with me," the answer you give can change not just their life, but your own, burning away everything that doesn't matter and leaving in its place something stronger than fear. A reason to keep believing in each other.